Trump's immigration policy is impacting illegal immigrants from across the world, but also particularly from India. What's the recourse? How can they really look at challenging this decision of the president is something we'll understand from Professor Alexander Holtzman, who joins me on this network. He's the Director of Deportation Defense Clinic and also Assistant Clinical Professor of Law. Thank you so much for joining us over here in the network. If I could begin with the orders itself that have been passed by President Trump on his first day. If you could break down what the deportation policy and the birthright citizenship policies, revoking that really means for Indians living in the United States of America as also illegal immigrants.
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. So there's a lot to break down, and I'll try to do it quickly. But the Trump administration on day one issued a series of executive orders that, of course, impacts the U.S. immigration system. They're dramatic and sweeping, and I suspect several of the executive orders will be enjoined or stopped in U.S. federal courts very soon. So a couple examples of the executive orders that brought about changes include sending 1,500 U.S. military troops to the border under a so-called invasion, largely, in my view, of asylum seekers, individuals seeking a better life in the U.S., including safety. But nonetheless, the Trump administration is using this specter of an invasion to send troops to militarize or further militarize the U.S. Border with Mexico, the U.S. southern border. In addition, the Trump administration is trying to restart the so-called Remain in Mexico program, or MPP, which required asylum seekers, other individuals seeking relief in U.S. immigration courts to wait in Mexico and then traverse a very dangerous journey, often in the middle of the night at 2 or 3 a.m. to make it to their court dates to fight their cases if they're able to escape from organizations that are seeking to kidnap a lot of these individuals and hold them for ransom. The Trump administration ended Biden administration's CBP-1 application, where individuals could seek to enter the United States with permission and be paroled into the United States to, for example, seek asylum. The executive orders also expanded what's called expedited removal, which is a means of more quickly trying to deport non-citizens in the United States, which many advocates fear prevents due process of law. So the typical scenario is that a non-citizen who the U.S. government is seeking to deport would have to place them in immigration court removal proceedings, where they have an opportunity, although they have to find an attorney, but they have an opportunity to either pay for a private attorney or hopefully find a pro bono free attorney to defend their case. However, with expedited removal, the process is much quicker. Now, technically, it's only applicable to individuals who have been in the U.S. for less than 2 years and are encountered within 100 miles of the border. However, as you probably know, the U.S. border includes our water borders, and so 2/3 of the U.S. population approximately live within 100 miles of the border, including where I am today in New York. Individuals in L.A., Seattle, Chicago would all be within 100 miles of the border. Additionally, the Trump administration executive orders are seeking to designate as transnational criminal organizations certain drug cartels or gangs, for example, the MS-13. And this has far-reaching implications for asylum cases, both good and bad, which would include individuals who are fleeing the MS-13 being able to now argue that this group is more sophisticated based on the government recognition, and perhaps that would help in an asylum case. But it could also hurt an individual who, for instance, was forced to pay a ransom to the MS-13. They could now be accused of supporting a transnational criminal organization. So those are a few examples. The Trump administration is also trying to end birthright citizenship under the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment, trying to reinterpret that clause, which I know we'll talk more about. And then a last item I'll mention, among many more I could, the Trump administration is putting a pause, perhaps a stop, on refugee resettlement, as has been reported, and that includes individuals who already had plane tickets to come to the U.S., including a large number of Afghanis who supported the U.S. government and military in Afghanistan in fighting the Taliban and now are stuck and are not currently able to resettle here as refugees. And so those are some of the examples of the Trump administration's recent executive actions.
Right. Professor Holtzman, in India, the concerns have been with regards to the news about deportations more than anything else, because H-1B visas, now that's a controversial subject, but it has nothing to do with how the Trump administration is thinking about those who are highly skilled, you know, people from India who've moved to the United States of America and in most cases are welcome. In this case, we're talking about undocumented Indians who are there, and according to some reports, there are about 18,000 in detention centers and 725,000 in total. So how do you see this decision impact these individuals, these Indians?
Yeah, so if the news reports recently are true, then it appears the Indian government may be willing to cooperate with the U.S. government in repatriating those 18,000 detained individuals. I saw that that was recently reported. Now, of course, that's true of every country, and the U.S. cannot simply deport unauthorized immigrants without the permission of that government to accept the deportations, or the permission of another government willing to accept deportees. And so for the 18,000 approximately who are in ICE detention centers, if the Indian government is willing to accept repatriation of those individuals, I suspect their deportation may be imminent depending on the status of their case. So if they're still, if certain individuals are still in removal proceedings, they have a right to the conclusion of those proceedings. And some of those individuals may be eligible for relief to be able to stay in the U.S. They may win asylum or other fear-based protections. There may be opportunities to have their cases dismissed in immigration court, depending on, you know, the charges that ICE brought and if they can sustain those charges. But I suspect that some of those individuals may well be deported if the Indian government is willing to repatriate a large number of those 18,000 detained individuals. And of course, detained non-citizens are more likely to be deported because the government has access to them and can more quickly effectuate those deportations.
Right. Now, the reports do say that these numbers that are coming out are all undocumented illegals or illegal Indians. Now, while there are reports that the Indian side is willing to cooperate with the American side in repatriation, if that's what is required, there are people who've spent a lot of money reaching America. So there are going to be legal hassles. They're not going to come back easily. What are the in many cases, we've seen people throw away their documents. So how are you going to identify nationality? Isn't that also going to be a challenge, that if India says, okay, we're going to take our people back, but there has to be proof of nationality? How does one do that, and what are the legal challenges there?
So it is relevant. It's not the case that non-citizens necessarily would discard evidence in their case. It's possible that they would want to retain that evidence to share it with their immigration attorneys, for instance. But sometimes individuals don't have, for instance, evidence of what we call alienage, where someone is from. Now, actually, in immigration court removal proceedings, the burden is on ICE to establish alienage first. So actually, ICE has to prove before the next step in the case that the client is from another country, for example, India. So they would need to, ICE would need to provide some form of evidence, a copy of a passport, for example, from India, from that individual. And if ICE is not able to sustain those charges in removal proceedings, the individual could have their case dismissed. That said, if ICE is able to establish alienage, thereafter the burden shifts to the non-citizen in that context to respond to the pleadings document. The charging document in immigration court is called a notice to appear. And then if they plead to the notice to appear, they then have to argue for relief, what they're eligible for to be able to stay lawfully in the United States.
What's the legal recourse for these undocumented Indians? If they're not identified, then the liability or the onus lies on the administration. But in a scenario, Professor Holtzman, where maybe President Trump thinks that it doesn't matter what the investigations are bringing out, we are just going to say that these are the people we want sent back and we would want to send them back to India. Can the Trump administration do that? Can the federal government really do that? Overturn decisions by courts and by agencies?
Not quite. So it's a little complicated, and every case is different, of course, but and it's a common law school answer here in the States anyway, of it depends. So it depends on a couple of things. So for example, if the individual is in removal proceedings in immigration court, they can't just be swiftly deported. They have an opportunity to hold ICE to their burden, to establish alienage, and then thereafter to seek relief in immigration court, and not until the conclusion of their removal proceedings, where there is a final order of removal or deportation, would they then be eligible to be deported. Now, that said, if someone is not in what are called removal proceedings under the Immigration and Nationality Act, INA 240 proceedings, if they're in other forms of proceedings, let's say if the individual crossed at the US-Mexico border, hasn't been in the US for 2 years, was caught within 100 miles of the border, and is subject to potentially expedited removal, they might be deported much more quickly. And so that individual would not, unfortunately, receive the same, what I consider due process in immigration court to move forward. So it depends a little bit on the status of a case. One last thing for detained individuals to consider is, are they eligible for bond? Could they be released from detention if an immigration judge finds that they're not a flight risk, they're likely to come back to court, and that they're not a danger to society, that they don't, for instance, have a significant criminal history that makes the judge worry that they're going to harm somebody in the United States. So if someone is able to establish eligibility for bond, they have to pay a minimum amount of $1,500. It could be more than that. They could be released on bond and then fight their immigration court case with an attorney outside of a detention center. So it depends on a variety of different factors for individuals.
Interesting point there, Professor Holtzman. But according to some reports, there are about 725,000 illegal Indians in total, and about 18,000 in detention centers. So how will these laws and these policies, how will they work for all these individuals? Are they now going to start identifying them and removing them? What's the process and the procedure that will follow now?
Yeah, so I saw the estimates of 725 approximately undocumented Indian nationals, I believe. Yes, and so the Biden administration set priorities for ICE enforcement. And those three priorities under the Biden administration were so-called threats to national security, public safety, or border security. And the way the Biden administration decided border security threats, allegedly, was to say individuals who entered the U.S. After November 1st, 2020, presumably for some political reasons of the Biden administration saying, if you're coming to the U.S. after when I was elected, you're going to be a priority for enforcement. So those were the Biden administration enforcement priorities, which Secretary of Homeland Security Mayorkas issued in a memo and then was interpreted through one of his staffers, Kelly Doyle's memo. After the Trump administration came into power this week, it rescinded those memos. So now those are no longer the priorities for enforcement. And presumably, currently, the Trump administration is prioritizing all unauthorized non-citizens. And so if there are 725 unauthorized Indian nationals in the United States, presumably they are now a priority for enforcement for the Trump administration, as would other individuals lacking immigration status be. And, could be subject to ICE enforcement actions. That said, ICE doesn't have the resources to do it all.
Okay, let's zoom out a little and talk about the policy itself, because we've seen the entire American society quite polarized when it comes to the policy itself. Many of them say that these immigrants make up for most of the jobs that nobody else wants to really do. And now but they're undocumented, yet they're the working class within the United States of America. Do you think the systems in America will crumble should the decision be taken to remove these undocumented individuals?
Yes, as you said, I think immigrants contribute to the United States in a myriad of important ways, from contributing tax dollars, whether it be at a local level with sales taxes, with purchasing power, contribute in creating jobs and small businesses as a driver of the U.S. economy. I think for those of us who value diversity, enrich our society in a myriad of ways, from art to food to culture and language in a variety of ways. And I think it would be absolutely detrimental. I think that these executive orders harm the United States in a variety of ways. I myself am a child of my mother is an immigrant from Serbia. The law school clinic that I direct, the Deportation Defense Clinic at Hofstra, teaches law students to defend immigrants in removal proceedings. And we've seen firsthand with our clients suffering due to these policies. And just one quick example, one of our clients was subjected to the migrant protection protocols, required to wait in Mexico. She was catfished online to Mexico for what she thought was a job in Mexico, a job opportunity. When she got there, she was kidnapped by drug cartels, forced into sex slavery. She was then sold to another drug cartel, which trafficked her into the United States via the southern border at gunpoint so that they could force her into prostitution. And they hoped in Texas she would earn more than in Mexico. They were caught by Customs and Border Protection at the US border. And she told her story and said, I'm scared to go back to Mexico. I've been sex trafficked. Help me. And she's eligible for a T visa, which now we've won, by the way. And what did CBP do? They turned her back to Mexico anyway, where she had to wait in a refugee camp in hiding from those same drug cartels until she was eventually able to enter the United States many months later, and luckily found our clinic, eventually obtained what's called a T visa for a trafficking victim, and now is on a path to being able to apply for a green card. She was eligible for immigration relief, but was turned back to Mexico and luckily survived, but many others didn't. Many others were kidnapped or killed while they're waiting in Mexico to pursue very meritorious claims. So that's one example of the type of harm that the Trump administration's actions, including the migrant protection protocols, cause to clients. But I think immigrants in this country contribute in a myriad of ways. I think these executive orders are taking the U.S. backward, and I think there'll be a point of national and worldwide shame as we look back historically on really one of the critical civil rights issues of our time, which I think immigration is, particularly in the United States.
There's been a clear narrative building by Donald Trump. On the one hand, he's made the distinction between illegal immigrants and those who have come legally. So he says he welcomes people who've legally entered the United States of America, skilled labor, so on and so forth. But he no longer wants illegal Indians or illegals from any country anymore. So the narrative actually that he's trying to set is that he's against those who break the law, but he's not xenophobic after all.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the narrative is still xenophobic, and remember that a lot of individuals seeking entry into the United States are following the law. Individuals who were signing up for CBP-1 were doing what the Biden administration told them to do, which was seek entry into the United States via this application on their phone. As problematic as it was, they were following the law, as problematic as the app was. Additionally, international law and U.S. treaties direct individuals to seek safety and seek asylum in a country, and so nearby. And so individuals seeking asylum at the U.S. border are doing what international law tells them to do, which is claim a fear of return to their home country and seek humanitarian protection. And the recent White House actions, even you could see on the White House webpage, for example, that immediately upon coming into office, the Trump administration ended the Spanish language webpage on the White House website. And what it said, well, at first, it's now been changed, but it said, go home. When you click on that link, it didn't say go to the homepage. Now it does. It said go home. When you clicked on the link, it was basically a Trump campaign video. And, you know, that distinction between authorized and unauthorized immigrants or xenophobia, for example, there are millions and millions of individuals in the U.S. who speak Spanish as a first language. My grandfather, who was a naturalized U.S. citizen, Serbian was his primary language, not English. And so to immediately kind of shut down these websites and demonize individuals who speak other languages, you know, I think is very concerning. Also, there are a lot of gray areas in the law regarding authorized immigration status and unauthorized. And it's not always so clear, even within U.S. law, whether someone is abiding by the rules laid out by Congress And that's a last important point to mention. A lot of these executive orders are exceeding the separation of powers under US law. It's not within a president's power to simply reinterpret the Constitution. That's for the courts to do. It's not within the president's power to try to do things like end asylum. That's Congress. That's our legislative branch that gets to decide that. And so I suspect a lot of these executive orders will be stopped and joined in federal court soon. But I think a lot of the intention here is to sow chaos, confusion, and fear.
The other important aspect that we'd like to discuss is that he comes with a mandate, and now he's ordered revocation of birthright citizenship. Your position on what that would mean for so many who've moved there, who've moved with their children or have had their children there, have had the American dream, and yet we are looking at a scenario, at a situation where they might not feel that they belong.
Yeah, so this is one of the executive orders that I am referring to that I think is very likely to be enjoined, that I think is completely unconstitutional. And I think our courts, even our current US Supreme Court, where where Trump during his first term appointed 3 of the justices, I think there are not the votes to support this unconstitutional measure. And I have the Constitution here, and the 14th Amendment is very clear, and I'll just read this sentence. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. And I'll end there. It seems crystal clear. Now, this attempt to reinterpret under the jurisdiction of, I think is laughable. Really, that was only referring to diplomats at the time. When this provision was enacted, it was crystal clear. It's been supported by Supreme Court precedent in Wong Kim going back to 1898 that individuals born in the United States derive birthright citizenship. So an attempt to execute an executive order to overturn centuries of Supreme Court law and our constitutional provision, I think is unconstitutional patently, and is going to be overturned soon. That said, it can create a great amount of fear. It already has, just by issuing this executive order in the interim. If it's not enjoined soon, it's also possible that after, I believe, February 19th, when it may go into effect, if only briefly, could delay individuals getting U.S. passports, Social Security cards, could sow confusion among families, immigrants, and fear. Certainly, I think is already taking hold. It also affects Indian nationals in other ways. As you mentioned earlier, individuals on H-1B visas for specialty occupations, individuals on L visas for intra-company transfers, on F visas for student visas, may have families, may be pregnant, may be due to give birth in the coming months. And now they're going to have to worry about how is the U.S. government going to recognize the citizenship of my child. And depending on the country that individuals are from, may also not have recognition from the country of their birth of then their child's birth, and could be stateless potentially if this executive order is not overturned. Again, I believe it will be soon, but in the interim, a lot of individuals are going to fear that now their children could be subject to deportation, when for centuries they didn't have to fear that because of clear U.S. constitutional law.
Right. Finally, Professor Holtzman, the fact is that this is a political decision. It's not where there was a committee or a council that sat together to decide, and they knew exactly what they were doing, how to tackle the problem of illegal immigration. This is a political decision. And if the courts order against the executive order, then does the president have the right to overturn the court order? And can he then pass another executive order? How does it work?
No. So although the Trump administration could try to do something like that, the courts could quickly enjoin it once again. But no, the executive branch, including the president in the United States, does not have authority to overturn court orders. And we saw this during the Trump administration with several of its policies being stopped in federal courts. And the Trump administration could not just execute another executive order to try to overcome that. That would also presumably be enjoined if it was based on the same faulty law, unconstitutional attempts to override the judicial branch and reinterpret the Constitution, or override our legislative branch and Congress. So absolutely not. You also mentioned the mandate earlier, and I wanted to address that. President Trump, won this election certainly, but by a relatively narrow margin of the popular vote, despite kind of media reports. And so I think the mandate itself is debatable. As you mentioned, kind of the rhetoric regarding immigration law itself has changed as well. And so, I think birthright citizenship, I've yet to see a poll that a majority of Americans support this decision. And in fact, I suspect not. I suspect that, the vast majority of American citizens and the voting population, I think, are not on board with ending birthright citizenship. And I think even U.S. citizens have reason to worry if this policy were kept in place, because all of us would need to be proving our status now in the United States. Would maybe need to consider, what documents do we have proof of? Obviously, you don't have memory of your birth, so how do you prove that you are a U.S. citizen? I personally don't have my passport on me right now. I also don't have my birth certificate. Hopefully, birth certificates will still be dispositive regarding citizenship in the United States going forward. And so I think even U.S. citizens should have cause for concern with a policy like this.
On that note, Professor Holtzman, thank you so much for joining us here on the India Today Network. Thank you.